The views expressed on the Nova Society are those of the panelists and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Phoenix Research Institute or any institution with which any panel member is associated. Reproduction or dissemination, other than for the purpose of education or information, without the expressed written permission of the Phoenix Research Institute or Nova Society Media is strictly prohibited. Welcome back to the Nova Society, the space where dialogue deepens understanding and civic responsibility comes to life. I'm Dr. Mark Bound, joined by my partner in crime, Dr. Scott Gershwer, and together we'll unpack the stories that matter most, exploring the headlines and history. The big ideas shaping today's conversations. Let's dive in and hear what our guests and listeners have for us today. Today we welcome Ramon Perez. Ramon is an expert in artificial intelligence, a former military officer, and executive director of the Digital Democracy Project. After years in both civic service and the tech sector, he's made it his mission to bridge the gap between citizens and government. DDP, which he leads, now operates in 7 states, empowering people to directly weigh in on the real legislation the representatives consider and to hold these officials publicly accountable for the outcomes. Ramon's approach stands out because he views political disengagement as a systems problem, one he tackles with transparency, technology, and steadfast nonpartisanship. Ramon personally connects to the struggle to make democracy matter for everyone, drawing on his own story after military service and on the inspiration of classmates who gave everything in defense of democratic ideals. Ramon frames his work to restore trust and invite all of us back into the conversation. So welcome, Ramon. All right, you are with the Digital Democracy Project. Very interesting. I was reading up on that. And one of the things that you mentioned is that you really think that disengagement is a systems problem. And I could probably agree with it. It just seems like we try to make people more disengaged as we move along with legislation. I'm thinking the SAVE Act, which I think could really not only disengage but disenfranchise some people. So tell us about DDP.
Right. So first of all, thank you for having me, Mark. I do appreciate
absolutely
being on. And the basic premise of Digital Democracy Project is that we're using new technology, specifically mobile voting software, that allows you to cast a secure ballot from your phone. Except that we're using it a different way. We're saying, if you can validate that a person is a U.S. citizen, is a resident of the state, and can find them on the voter file, and they have a photo ID and all that, and then we have this cryptographically secure voting platform, well, then why should we have to wait every 4 years to have a say in the government, or every 2 years for a House race? Why shouldn't we be able to have the Netflix of government? Why can't we create government on demand? So that's precisely what we are doing with Digital Democracy Project. We take legislation that's currently being debated in Congress or in the state capitol, we put that into the app. We let people read about the bills, digest them for themselves, study the policy, and decide how they want their legislator to vote on their behalf. So they cast a secure ballot. It's basically an advisory vote, but it's using the real mechanism of a software called Votes, VOATZ, which has been certified in several states, predominantly for military voters overseas, but also people with disabilities who have trouble getting to the polls. Some tribal areas are now using it because of the long distance to the polls. So this mobile voting software, we think, is a very exciting development, and it allows people to have greater engagement in their system of government. But we're just showing the tool as a alternative to writing an email or sending a letter, where we can be cryptographically secure that this is a real human being and a real registered voter, so that the legislator gets input from people that they know are in their districts, they know they're registered to vote, and they have that before they go and take a vote on the floor of the Congress, so they know what their districts want. So that's the value to the legislator, is basically like, real-time free polling, because we do this as a nonprofit, we're a public service. The value to the voter, however, is that at the end of the legislative session, we compare what did the people want, how did people vote in the app, to how did the legislator vote on the exact same bill on the floor, and we compare them. So every legislator gets something like a scorecard that shows all the bills that we've carried, what did the people want, how did the representative vote, and did it match? And so they all get a score that you can very quickly compare from one legislator to another to see how often do they actually represent their districts. So what we're hoping for in this process is a greater sense of agency, that voters feel like they can have a real say in the process because they want to be heard and they are currently not being heard. But they also want some accountability that, like, hey, if I'm going to give you my knowledge about what I want from you, I expect you to follow through on that. And our district, says this is what we think is best for our community, and you're our representative from this community. You should be voting alongside the district, not alongside the lobbyists or the party bosses or the whoever's funding your campaign. You should be voting as a representative of your district.
That is very interesting. And, it would be nice. I mean, one of the things that we've always said here is that, like in my state of South Carolina, Lindsey Graham is our senator. Ugh, don't even, anyway. But this last time around, he won 56% of the vote, which means 44% of the people voted against him. And sometimes I don't even, if you look at his voter record, I speak about Lindsey because first of all, I know him. And second of all, because I can really, it impacts me, his voting record. And, as I'm looking at this, he doesn't seem to vote either for his constituents or for the people that were against him. He's more a party guy. Mm-hmm. And I think we see a lot of that in today's politics. They're party guys. Do you think that this might fix that? Because let's face it, if you're a congressman, you got a 95% chance of getting voted back in.
Right. I think that's exactly the premise. So let's come back to the point you mentioned at the top, which is that this is a systems level problem. Why is there so much disengagement? The disengagement exists on purpose. I would say the smoking gun is gerrymandering in a lot of ways.
Oh, absolutely.
It is about the fact that we draw districts so that voters are not heard. It's intentional that, and Democrats and Republicans both do this together. They draw a district where they don't have to hear from the minority party because they have a very solid base that they can speak to, and they don't worry about having a legitimate contender in the November election. Their main concern is now somebody outflanking them from the left or from the right, depending on your party, in the primary election. In the primary, only about 8 to 10% of voters vote, and those are the most ideologically purist voters in that party. So the process of gerrymandering the districts has become almost like a data-driven scalpel at this point, where individual boundaries along street lines that can divide communities for the purposes of, packing and cracking these districts. I'll give you an interesting statistic. There are more registered Republicans in California than there are in Florida. The registered Republicans in California represent about 8 U.S. House seats of Republicans from the California delegation. Registered Republicans in Florida have 20 U.S. House seats from the Florida delegation. Same number of voters. The actual Republicans in California are slightly more than the ones in Florida. Same number of voters, but in California, they get 8 districts. In Florida, they get 20, because the opposite is true. Florida overrepresents Republicans because they draw the maps to make sure that's the case. California underrepresents Republicans because they draw the maps to make sure that's the case. And we're now going through another round of this, gerrymandering wars, where Texas kicked off a new round of trying to squeeze more seats out of the Texas delegation. California went the opposite way. Where I am in Virginia, they're about to vote on trying to gerrymander those districts again. So we're going to get to the point where every 2 years, every time there's an election, we're going to gerrymander the districts based on whoever won. And we've got this sort of vicious cycle. And if you think about it, this is the only politics is the only place where the people who compete are also the people who write the rules. Imagine if it was a football game or a baseball game where the players on the field are also the referees. That's the situation that we're in. The active legislators write the rules that they will then compete in the next election. And I think that's the fundamental conflict of interest that we see that results in that level of disenfranchisement. There's a really fascinating Princeton study from a few years ago that showed that when you take took looking at hundreds of issues where there was good polling, and then there is a bill that compares to the polling, and hundreds of issues over the course of time where, let's say, the voters supported an issue by 80%, it had a 30% likelihood of passing in Congress. And alternatively, the voters supported an issue 10%, meaning like 90% were against it, it still had a 30% chance of passing in Congress. So basically, the voter input had no relevance whatsoever on what was likely to pass in Congress. And it comes back to the point that you were making, Mark, where it's basically impossible to remove incumbents. Most of the time, they only leave because they die or retire. They're reelected at a 91% rate. The statistics show that 80% of Americans live in a one-party state where the three branches of government are controlled by one political party. 90% of Americans live in a one-party House district, meaning it's very safe red or safe blue. And the 2024 elections were the least competitive on record, meaning that the smallest number of districts that were within a 5 percentage point margin of victory in November. It was something like 40 some districts in the whole country. And that's about out of the 435 House districts. 2026 is projected to be worse because we're going through this round of gerrymandering again. So if you look at it from a practical standpoint, when people say, why bother to register to vote, or why bother to vote? Nobody listens to me. In a lot of ways, that's actually true, depending on where you live. This is the kind of crazy thing. You're in a couple of key battleground House districts or a couple of key battleground states during a presidential race. People pay a lot of attention to what you have to say, and everybody else gets ignored. So I think what we're hoping for is to level that playing field. We're hoping that the technology can give people back that sense of having a stake in the system, having some agency in this process, and being able to be heard again. So that is exactly what our goal is. But what you're going to need, to your point about Lindsey Graham, is what you're going to need now is, we're building the platform, we're building the tools, but what you're going to need is a bunch of people running for office who are promising to be bound by this philosophy of listening to the voters, using this technology, rather than basing all their decisions on what the party apparatus says, or the people who are paying for their campaigns, or the special interests or the lobby groups or whatever. And we're fortunate that we've had about 36 or so legislators in Florida, state House and Senate, and then a bunch of candidates as well, who have endorsed Digital Democracy Project and who are promising to their voters that they will be held accountable to voter participation using this technology. We actually had one gentleman who's running for U.S. House in the Florida 11th district, a guy named Dan Williams, who's gone even further than that. He's a college professor who teaches technology, who said, no, I will be a pure avatar of the people. It will be my job to explain the legislation the best way I can, provide you, the members of my district, with all the pros and cons and all the gritty details. And maybe I'll give my opinion about what I think is best, but ultimately I'll leave it to them to make the decision. And I will trust their guidance, and I will vote according to my district, regardless of party, regardless even of my own opinion. It'll be my job to inform them. It'll be their job to decide. So he's gone even a step further than all others. And I think what it's going to take is a bunch of servant leaders to really run for office under this kind of premise, because now we have the tools to make this possible.
You're talking about this being a systematic thing, and I think this would be a good start. But I think we also need term limits. We have too many representatives that are like in there forever. I mean, here in South Carolina, they would have, I swear, they would have elected Strom Thurmond again, even though he was dead. I mean, just kind of the way it works. Just kind of the way it works. The other thing, you got term limits being one, and also increasing the size of the House. When we think about how many people one representative actually represents, it's like massive. We should have so many more representatives, so many more districts. And I think that something like this would really be beneficial to those members. Like if you're representing 100,000 people, that's a pretty good number of people. I mean that is a good number.
Yeah.
We look at Great Britain. Great Britain has 65 million people. They have over 600 members of parliament. We've got over 350 million people, and we got 435. That makes no sense. So to ask for somebody to get sufficient representation, and I like the idea that this platform that you're trying to create is going to basically give a score where the voters can learn about the issues and they can submit to their representative what they want done.
Right.
And then you've got the data. And then after the representative votes, now you could score him. Did you do what your voters wanted to do, or did you not? Because like I say, today we're really running into a political environment where it's all about party. It is totally about party. And that is, I think that this might help quite a bit for people to actually sit back and say, wait a minute, am I voting in my own best interest when I elected this guy or woman?
Exactly.
And I think it's an interesting project. Hey, Scott.
Just hi guys. Just wondering about what the voters of South Carolina would say, and it kind of makes me think like, well, they liked having the Confederate flag up, and they liked having Jim Crow laws. So you're in a danger spot there when you start asking some people what it is that they want to vote for and pledge yourself to doing exactly what they've asked you to do.
Yeah, that could be a pitfall, because let's face it, it's sort of like when we talk about juries. You're putting your fate in the hands of 12 people not smart enough to get out of jury duty. So here you are.
I think look, you raised some valid points. I'll come to the issue of term limits, because you cover a lot of really good ideas there, Mark. Right? So the term limits is one of those policies that 80+% of Americans agree with. Absolutely. And yet it never gets a committee hearing. It never makes any traction whatsoever in the process. That would be an example where we've got great ideas that exist, but they can't get past the political mechanism to become law because they don't satisfy the incumbents who are controlling the political gatekeeping. So what this technology allows, I think, is not only greater visibility into what people want, but in a way that actually is verifiable to a congressman's district. So that, I think, is a key differentiator. That you can do polling. For one, polling is expensive. So there's not a lot of legislators are going to spend money on polling that unless it's, every once a couple of years during a contested political cycle, they might do it. But you're not really going to do a ton of polling. So a lot of them get a lot of email or letters from their constituents, but they don't really trust it because email there's a ton of form emails that are sent now. A lot of AI generated emails are flooding their inboxes. If they can't trust that this is a real human being rather than a robot, or if they can't trust it, maybe it's a real human being, but they don't know if that person's actually in their district, a lot of that gets discarded. I've spent a lot of time in Tallahassee or on Capitol Hill and watched how these guys work. They get flooded with inbox spam that just gets filtered out. It's just completely disregarded. So we're trying to find a mechanism where legislators can have greater confidence in what their district wants, but at the same time, that sort of free public polling comes with strings attached, which is that you now are going to be held accountable to doing what the district expects in return. The other thing you mentioned about expanding the size of the Congress, I think, is very valid, because when the Constitution was written, a congressman had about 20,000 constituents, right, based on the numbers at the time. Now they have 750,000 constituents. So it's not reasonable to expect them to be able to keep account of what all their constituency wants from them, or to go and do town halls where they know everybody. It's just not a realistic ask. So I think there's some really interesting ideas. I think the Fair Representation Act spoke to the idea of multi-member districts, where we already have multi-member districts at the state, right? We have 2 senators for every state. The proposal would be maybe you have 2 senators for every House district as well, and the party that wins gets a greater percentage vote than the party that loses, for example. But there is representation. That's an interesting idea. So I think Portland just did their city charter. If you remember, like, Portland effectively was taken over by anarchist groups during the 2021. The city governments just completely ceded control of the city for several blocks of the downtown area. And I was in Portland shortly thereafter. It was a nightmare. It reminded me of a lot of places I'd been. I lived in Latin America for many years. I lived in East Asia and in Europe, and have traveled a lot with the military and afterwards. And I think what I saw there was kind of scary, because it helped me quickly understand that the collapse of trust in government, this is not a right-wing concept. This is if you can't do the basics of what democracy needs to do, if people lose faith in the process because they don't think it will deliver for them anymore, they will look to alternatives, and you're not going to like what they find. It's either going to be dictatorship or it's going to be anarchy. And I think that we have to come back to a system that delivers for people. And so we need to modernize the infrastructure of that system. And I think systemic change is what's necessary here. There are going to be a lot of ways to solve this problem, and what we're proposing is just one of them. I don't want to make the claim that digital democracy is going to do this all on its own. I think the key is going to be things like term limits or multi-member districts, ranked choice voting, opening all the primaries in all the states. All of these things are going to be incredibly important to fixing the systemic problem that we find ourselves with. But it's also incredibly difficult for independents and third parties to get onto the ballot, because ballot access rules are written by the 2 political parties to prevent that from happening. So we need a lot of ways to fix a system which has been sort of intentionally broken over the course of decades, and we're just now waking up to the ramifications of what happens when you carve voters out of the process.
Right. Yeah, I don't think, this project or any project on its own is going to fix the issues, because it's a systemic problem that has just gotten worse over time. And when we talk about the idea of people agreeing with each other, I wouldn't agree with Ted Cruz on anything, but he is for term limits. Me and him do agree on that, which surprises the heck out of me. So, all right, today, if we look at the mood of politics today as far as elections are concerned, there isn't a lot of trust in the elections. With what you're doing here, how are you going to maintain the trust? Because we're in a society today where if I lose, it must be rigged.
Right.
Or if my congressman votes this way, well, you know what? That data that came in from DDP must have been fake news. Mm-hmm. How are you going to address that issue in a system that already almost nobody trusts it?
Right. Yep. That is a core challenge. And I often tell my team that we're not here to build technology. We're here to build trust. The technology can enable it, but there's a lot of other things that we have to do to make that possible. It starts from the fact that we were intentional about having a board of directors that represents all political persuasions, Republicans, Libertarians, Democrats, Forward Party, the Democratic Socialists of America. Basically we're trying to make sure that every point of view can be captured in our leadership structure. but also the fact that we did this as a nonprofit rather than a for-profit organization. So we can't be twisted by some shareholders that want to influence the process or try to put their thumb on the scales. The other thing is that we were intentional about using the Votes mobile app, which is certified by several states for real elections for military voters overseas, and is now being used for just general purpose voting. So the Mexican government allowed all Mexican citizens outside the country to vote absentee using the Votes app. The government of Ontario has enabling legislation that is allowing municipal governments to vote from their phones. So dozens of cities have now signed up and will be carrying out voting from the phone using the Votes app in their upcoming elections. They've done so in previous cycles, but for limited cases, and now it's basically coming into the widespread general public. So Votes itself has had about 5 million votes cast on the phone in a variety of jurisdictions, and has done tons of work to try to build trust through independent auditing, and the fact that the blockchain itself is not under their control. It's several different independent organizations, including the political parties, who independently validate the data on the blockchain. In fact, we're talking about becoming an independent auditor on the blockchain ourselves. So the other thing is that by using this software, we protect the secret ballot. So what's specifically quite difficult about mobile voting is that you have to validate that the person is a real person, that person lives in that district, has a photo ID where the selfie matches their face, but you still have to protect the secret ballot so that their privacy is ensured. And that's a core challenge of the process. And so a lot of the development in homomorphic encryption, end-to-end verification that now makes this possible is also critically important, because that means that we, as Digital Democracy Project, we know that Mark and Scott are real people. We know that you're verified, and we know whatever the state gives us on the voter file, that's what we would know. So we would be able to find you on the voter file in your respective state. But then once you cast your ballot, we can't see it. We can't even see, we can see that you're verified, but we can't see which bills are you voting on, because it's all encrypted. So we don't have any view into that. And actually, that's the way I like it, because that means that we have no ability to influence you. We have no ability to manipulate the results. We can't put our thumb on the scales and say, oh, we really would like it if people all voted in favor of this bill or against that bill. We can't. We have no influence on that. So that's also how we build trust in the system, is that we sort of take ourselves out of any position of being able to have any control in that situation. So it's not just the technology, though. I think it's also us as an organization making sure that we are not taking a position on any particular piece of legislation. We obviously care about voting rights, and we want people to have the ability to express their right to vote without a lot of encumbrances or constraints. But we provide a platform, right? It is not for us to make your decision for you. So if, let's say, we recently rolled out an AI chatbot tool that's on our website, where we prefetch all of the hundreds of thousands of pages of legislative documents and put it into the knowledge bank for our chatbot. So if you go on the SAVE Act, or the Iran War Powers Resolution, or we just loaded one yesterday on Cuba, because now there's this, all this discussion about invading Cuba. So there's a Cuba War Powers Resolution that we just loaded yesterday, and we prefetch all of the text from the legislation. We put it into the chatbot's knowledge, so you can ask detailed questions about the bill and get a much greater level of fidelity than you would get on ChatGPT or a Google search, so that you can be as informed as possible to make your decision. And so I think when we do that, we also have to be cognizant about which AI models are we using? Are we providing unbiased information? Are we making sure that it's giving good and accurate results about how did my legislator vote on this bill? Is it pulling the correct records so that when it says to somebody, Rick Scott voted yes for the One Big Beautiful Bill and voted no on the Ukraine supplemental, that's accurate information. So we have to validate our data all throughout the lineage and make sure if we find mistakes, we correct it quickly. So it's a lot of those things that we have to do in order to build and maintain trust, because you're absolutely spot on. The only way this works is if we can prove to people that as an independent nonprofit organization, we can do a better job of delivering an unbiased platform than the alternatives, which is potentially a biased media, a biased social media feed, biased political parties, a biased, a biased elections apparatus or whatever, so that people can at least have some confidence that the information we're giving them is not manipulated.
So I guess one of my questions is, because you talk about getting the data from the state, and we've already seen some legal challenges to what happened in Atlanta and what's happened around.
Mm-hmm.
And you're a not-for-profit. Do you see that this might be a huge, not only state being willing issue, but maybe a legal issue to be able to give this data to a not-for-profit or some, and again, there's a whole bunch of examples of organizations that aren't really connected to the government, but they get data, but that data is really hard to come by. Do you see a problem getting this data?
Yeah, that's going to be a challenge. I mean, every state has its own rules. Every state runs its own elections, right?
Absolutely.
We should start with that basis.
It should be done.
And fine. I mean, I think federalism. We're seeing the advantages of federalism, in the sense that the independence of states is a key enabling factor in what makes the United States successful, in my mind, and that it's more so that we have 3,000 independent elections administrators at the county level, who follow guidance from the state, but they basically run their own elections at the county level. So when it comes to voter files, yes, every state is different. Some states make it easier than others. Usually, because we are a 501c3 nonprofit specifically focused on voting rights and voter education, we tend to check the box in just about every state. But there are some states, I think Illinois is probably the most restrictive, where you have to be, and Massachusetts, where you have to be a political party to get the voter file, or a candidate running for office to get the voter file, unless you get a special waiver from the Secretary of State. So I would actually argue that maybe that's not the way to go. Like, why should the parties get access? Because again, the parties write the rules. That's why the parties get access, right?
Exactly.
So that they can like hit you up 1,000 times a week for donations from whatever candidate, but provide you what in terms of value, I don't really know. So I think, but for the most part, we've been able to accomplish this with our current status. We're in 7 states right now. Well, I should say that we actually do, as of this year, have the ability to verify voters in all 50 states down to the U.S. House level, and we've got in 7 states, we do it down to the state house and state senate level. So we're carrying state level legislation in Virginia, Washington, Utah, Arizona, Michigan, Massachusetts, and Florida. And our ambition is to be in all 50 states by the end of the year, so that by the next legislative session, you'll be able to vote on all state legislation as well as federal legislation, regardless of which state you live in. And then going forward after that, our intention is to get down to the local level. We'd love it if people could have a say in what's going on in their school board, what's going on in their city government. So that gets a lot more difficult, just getting information from those, the further down you go, the harder it is to get reliable, consistent updates about what's being put in front of the county board, or what's being deliberated on in your school board, and who voted how in your city government, that kind of a thing. So that'll be, but first things first, let's get to all 50 states. But you're right. I have seen some legislation now going through the pipeline, I think in Washington, which is one of the states that we're active in, where they want to close off access to the voter file because of these, I guess, threats, you could say, from the federal government of the situation we're seeing where people just don't trust the federal government, right? They don't trust the federal government with their voter files, so they want to close off access to voter files, and we may be a casualty in that conflict. I'm hoping that's not the case. Hopefully, they'll maintain access for 501c3 voter education groups, but we will see how that develops.
What you got, Scott?
I have to say, this is just hopefully a humorous aside. Have you had pushback on the word democracy?
Yes. Yes. I maybe take a certain amount of pride in being thrown out of the offices of several legislators at this point, but bipartisan ejection. So I've had, yes, I think when I've been either politely escorted out or angrily told to see my way out, it's for a variety of reasons. Amongst Republicans, it's often the argument that, this is a republic, not a democracy. You've got democracy in the name. You must be aligned with Democrats. Some of the Democrats who thought that we were operating some sort of a stalking horse for Ron DeSantis, and we were going to try to force him to vote the way the governor wanted them to vote. I was amazed by that reaction. But we've had, some of the early adopters were actually Republicans in Florida. We had a senior Republican senator out of Ocala named Keith Perry, who sponsored a bipartisan appropriation on our behalf and got Democrats across the aisle to work with him. So we had a junior Democrat out of the House named Rita Harris, who's great, and then a senior Republican named Keith Perry, and they pushed legislation all the way through the Florida budget process and got Digital Democracy Project funded in the Florida legislature. And then Ron DeSantis line item vetoed us. So it's like, I don't know what to say to that. It's the Republicans who looked at what we do and say, well, this is just free public polling. I normally spend 40, 50 grand every election cycle to get the kind of data that these guys are trying to give me for free. Like, what's not to love? But the people who've been against it, it's usually the accountability piece that we're talking about. Oh, you're gonna you're gonna match how I vote on the floor to what, like, the district? Ooh, I don't know about that so much. And that has been from Republicans and Democrats alike. I mean, I think it's look, you've got people who go to serve in office who truly think of themselves as Mr. Smith goes to Washington. They are there for a purpose to represent their communities. They may be conservatives, they may be progressives or whatever. They may come from a very conservative district, and they think this is a great tool to help me hear from my district, especially on issues that split the party. That's the key thing, right? There are plenty of times where they don't want to take a tough vote because they don't know how the party's going to land on it. The Epstein files would be probably the biggest example that we could think of, right? For the Democrats, it's been Gaza and support for Israel, right? In 2024 and even ongoing. Well, now that's splitting the Republicans right now. So they understand the things that split Republicans from Democrats, and they know where they're going to land on that. Where they like it is when it splits their own party and they're not really sure what to do, and they'd like to hear from their constituents. And so if they're in a really red district or a really blue district, and like, they're not necessarily scared of democracy, they're really interested in, like, what's that boundary that keeps me from getting primaried?
Right.
So,
right.
And then the other question I was going to raise was about Elon Musk. And just, his ability to manipulate data and dig into systems, probably second to none. There's a lot of people out there in Silicon Valley now who would look at this as a big juicy steak to eat, and they have the capabilities, and they don't particularly care about a free society. They sort of have taken this stance of, I know what's best for everybody. I've become a multimillionaire myself, or a billionaire myself, and I have something going on that most people don't. so I'm going to make the decisions for them. And I think that you would always, anytime you're talking about technology, want to be careful about running into them and figuring out how to safeguard your system from being hacked by people who professionally hack for a living.
Right. So the primary reason that we established ourselves as a nonprofit, against the advice of a lot of people who were like, hey, you should try to make a lot of money from this. Why not go become rich? But the primary reason we did this as a nonprofit was specifically so that we wouldn't have shareholders who would try to sell the organization to some billionaire or sell it to Facebook or sell it to whoever, right? So we wouldn't be influenced by, pick your billionaire bad guy, whether it's Musk or whether it's George Soros, if you want to talk to the Republicans about. But we wouldn't have any concern that one of those types of folks could buy the organization and then manipulate the results to get the outcome that they wanted on whatever policy that they care about. So that's one key thing. The other thing is that let's say for a moment that the technology itself, so the Votes app that we use, that is a commercial business. Let's say that the technology itself was purchased and manipulated. Well, we have alternatives now that are popping up. So if you know a gentleman named Bradley Tusk, who philanthropically has the mobile voting project, he has been building an open source version of this software and giving it away to governments to use, called Vote Secure. So now we're seeing there's more essentially competition for the technology, the core technology. The same thing with the AI part. We're heavily lean in on AI for reading the legislation and understanding the bills in a fine-grained detail. Let's say that, right now we use GPT, let me see, for the specific legislative deep policy analysis, it's GPT-5. But we use a lot of Anthropic tools as well for code creation and other things. But let's say that we can no longer trust the AI that we're using. We have the ability to swap that out with a different one that is more trustworthy. So I think as an organization, Digital Democracy Project, we don't try to build the enabling foundational technology. What we try to do is stitch together several different technologies in a way that can ultimately serve our mission. And I think that's important as well, so that if one of those fundamental technologies were to become a problem, that we can still complete our mission by swapping out those tools.
Yeah. And since I've been a bit of a Debbie Downer here, I'm going to say something positive. My wife is involved in a grassroots organization here in Connecticut, and they just recently had a town hall meeting online where they brought in all the non-incumbents who are primarying Congress people here in Connecticut and gave them a forum to speak to people. And it was very well attended, apparently. It scared one of the incumbents enough so that he's actually signed on to speak to them, to this group in the near future. And I think that you were mentioning local elections and things like that. That this group of mostly 60-year-old and up women, into their 80s, are very, very active in their local politics. And that you need to speak to them about this, and they have networked with groups in pretty much every state at this point.
Yeah, we would love to. We would love to. We're an all volunteer group of developers and organizers and legislative policy analysts, and we don't spend money on marketing. We spend our money on servers and software licenses and AI tokens and those types of things to make the platform work. But our outreach strategy is entirely about grassroots community engagement with the types of people you specifically mentioned. Also, the kinds of people in your audience who are connected to these types of organizations. That's key for us. The League of Women Voters has been an incredible partner. They've hosted dozens and dozens of fora to put us in front of voters, either members of the league or other voters, to talk about our resources and what we can provide and how people can get engaged. There are Represent Us, Fair Vote, Rank the Vote. We just had a call with Adam Kinzinger's team, for example. There are a lot of organizations that I think that we talk to, because we believe that's the way that we're going to spread the message, is amongst people who want to be engaged and just don't have the tools to have an active say in the process. The other thing that's interesting that you point out is, we did some analysis early on because people were concerned that if this is a mobile app, it would be a lot of young people would get involved, but older folks would struggle with the technology and they wouldn't engage. So we did a little bit of analysis on just taking a look at the voters who are verified in the system and the birth year that's on the voter file. And we actually found that the average birth year of people who had registered into Digital Democracy Project was 1962, the average birth year. We have somebody in the system with a 1939 birth year. We were actually impressed by just the fact that a lot of older voters were not put off by using the mobile app and having to go through this verification process. And I will be the first to acknowledge that it's somewhat onerous. You have to take a selfie scan and a picture of a photo ID that matches with the voter file. So we have to trace that whole lineage. And for a lot of people, that feels like a heavy burden, right? We acknowledge that completely, but have been impressed by the number of older voters that have been willing and able to successfully complete that process, to the point where our concern actually flipped, and we're like, oh wow, why aren't we getting enough young voters into this process? And then partly it's just younger voters tend not to be engaged on legislative policy analysis, and but we do have somebody who was registered to vote like 2 months before signing up for our project. So that was kind of cool. Like 18 years, just had turned 18 2 months prior and was already on it. So I think it comes down to, obviously, the individuals. If we have verified about 24,000 voters so far, we need to figure out how we're going to get 240,000 and then 24 million and then 240 million voters. But I think the way it starts is if we can just get the 1% of highly engaged, active people who are the kind of people who write an email to their congressman, or they go to a protest, or they'll call the switchboard, or whatever they'll do. If we can get 1% of registered voters into the system, that's still 2 million voters. And that's a level of democratic engagement that we've never experienced in this country. So I think it's very exciting, and the technology allows that to happen at a scale that's never been possible before, and still maintaining the veracity of the process.
And Scott, if you didn't get the message, you and I are those older voters.
I was born in 1962, so
I was born in 61. So we are, Mr. Perez here, who is considerably younger than we are, has identified us as the older voters in the room. And before you came on, Scott, he's going to be speaking with Travis Miserel.
Oh yeah, great.
Which I think is, I think they'll mesh together pretty well. So, all right. So I've got some of our listeners who say, okay, I want to be able to register. Where do they go?
digitaldemocracyproject.org. You can go on to our website. You can do a Google search for Digital Democracy Project, and there are links to either download the Votes app, or you can also vote on the web. So we actually encourage people to vote on the web as well. It's a great experience, and a lot of older voters like the big screen format. So we roll that out.
Older, not mature. All right.
That's right. Remember, Ramon, we do own it. We own the older thing. It's really quite all right. So, all right, because we did put in your area where people that are listening to this, we did put in that website. Now, when they go onto the website, and I'm on the website right now, if I want to go to the menu,
go to the menu at the top left and go to vote, and you should see links to
To register.
Vote on the web or download the app. Yep, exactly.
Gotcha.
And it'll take you through the onboarding process.
And you know what? I think that's a great idea. People, if you want to be heard, this is a way to do it. And we've said so many times on this podcast, if you didn't vote in the last election, you can't complain. Mm-hmm. And a lot of cases, you can allow your feelings about the system to override whether or not you're going to participate in the system. But it only works if you are actually participating in the system. And also to our listeners, I will be putting this up on our page, Ramon's TEDx talk. Look at you go. The TED, he's talking to a bunch of old people in the audience, so that'll be fun to watch. So how long do you think this is going to, I mean, just give us how long before you get to where you really believe you're going to be making an impact?
I actually think if you can get 1% of voters in to engage, that is actually a ton of voters, to the point where legislators have no choice but to pay attention. Now, especially because we're seeing a lot of legislators already endorsing the project. You can see them on our page as well. And I think that's going to put pressure when you've got people like Dan Williams who are running for office, promising a completely new concept for participatory democracy. You need people like that to win those seats and then govern that way. And so people say, well, wait a minute, the Florida 11th district has somebody in office who's voting the way the district wants. Why don't I have that in my district? I think that becomes a snowball effect. Imagine if all the voters in the country had a say on whether or not we go to a war with Iran. That's the vision here, right? That is the vision, that before we get this country embroiled in another Middle Eastern war where, I did 4 combat zone deployments. I feel like, shouldn't we have an opportunity to weigh in on that when our sons and daughters, our friends and family are the ones being sent to fight? Our treasure, our taxpayer dollars, they're asking for $200 billion to fund that, right? We already spend $1 trillion a year on the Defense Department, and they want another $200 billion to pay for this war. So shouldn't we as citizens have a say in that process? If you go back 800 years to the Magna Carta, that was the original premise of the Magna Carta, was that King John, was trying to engage in war without asking the permission of essentially the landed aristocrats who had to fund the thing, right? And they basically said, no more, like, we're not going to just keep paying for these endless wars unless we have a say in the process. That was the original basis of participatory democracy. And I feel like we now have the tools to do precisely that. We ought to be able to ask all Americans to weigh in on these types of critical decisions. So I think that, yes, it's going to take some time, but I imagine that once we flip a couple of districts where people now, we get maybe it's a small number of members of the U.S. House, it could be 2 or 3, but in such a tightly divided House, those 2 or 3 could be kingmakers who are ultimately deciding policy for the whole country based on actual voters in the district telling them how to vote on these critical issues. That could be an important linchpin that becomes a fulcrum point for this process to steamroll. So I think that the technology makes it inevitable. I just think that what we want is a governing structure to make certain that we can trust the process, and that's what we spend our time on. So the technology enables this. The government could pick this up and do it right now. We don't need to be doing this, right? The government has the tools to do this on its own. And why isn't it is probably the question, right? Right. So we're going to have to do it ourselves until it becomes essentially the de facto mechanism for voters to have input into the process. And then government, I think, and the politicians have to conform, and then ultimately government will take this over and implement it on its own.
So you are in how many states right now?
We can verify voters in all 50 states. So if you want to vote on federal bills, any American who's registered to vote can vote on federal bills. When it comes to state legislation, we're actively in 7 states. That's Florida, Virginia, Washington, Utah, Arizona, Michigan, and Massachusetts. And our goal is to be in all 50 states by the time the 2027 legislature comes around.
Yeah, that's good. So if I'm in South Carolina, if I want to talk about federal legislation, so anybody out there, if you're not in those listed states, it doesn't matter. Please sign up for this and get involved, because
Right.
it really is. It sounds like a very good. I kind of like when you were mentioning, yeah, they're all for the free polling. It's sort of like when you get that thing in the mail that says, "Hey, come and free dinner on us," and then you're stuck listening to the pitch. Well, they want the free polling. They don't want to have to listen to the pitch. And I can see where accountability and the transparency of this might, make a few of those elected officials think twice about supporting something like this. And, my final question to this is, do you think that this is something that's going to require legislation to become a real reality?
I think eventually, if we can get enough state House and Senate members elected on the premise of being true servant leaders, then yes, they will need to drive policy to make substantive structural change, and this would be one of them. But there's loads of things we've talked about on this podcast that would be part of a package of substantive change. But things like ranked choice voting and opening primaries and multi-member districts and a variety of things would be on the table, and we're seeing that happen at the city level in a variety of places that are redoing their charter. I like the idea of citizen assemblies being a consistent process for creating new legislation by hearing directly from almost like a jury pool of voters to weigh in on different topics. And we're actually exploring the ability to let people use technology to draft legislation and put it into our process. So I think that will be coming. It's in the pipeline, but I think that's a really exciting development is being able to build a bill, or maybe take an existing bill and amend it. Let citizens propose a way to make a piece of legislation better, to amend some of the problems with a particular bill that are often oversights, because these bills are drafted practically in a secret room and like foisted upon the members in an 11th hour vote-a-rama, where they don't ever really even get to read it. So they don't even discover a lot of the problems until after the fact. So maybe we can push the technology a little more upstream and allow that to be possible. I will say one last thing to Scott about your point on Jim Crow, is that Jim Crow persisted in South Carolina for a long time, and we could say that people like Jim Crow, but the reality is we never asked them. We never let everybody vote on whether or not to maintain Jim Crow, because 30% of the population wasn't allowed to vote on whether or not to maintain Jim Crow, simply because Jim Crow boxed them out of the system. South Carolina actually had a long legacy of voter disenfranchisement. It was actually the least democratic before the Civil War, because even white voters, if they didn't meet the property requirements, were not allowed to vote in South Carolina. South Carolina chose its own electors in the presidential election, so that voters never actually had a say in voting for president. This was antebellum period, and the property requirements were so restrictive that it basically was an aristocratic planter class that governed the state, not the voters, not even the white male voters who ostensibly had the right to vote, but were essentially, there was a proto Jim Crow that existed in South Carolina before the Civil War that prevented white men who were middle class or lower class, as well as women, and obviously enslaved people. So it was a very small electorate in the state. I think it was something about 20 or 25% of white men could vote in South Carolina prior to the Civil War. So compared to something around 80% in Massachusetts and New England at the same period. So I think that the voter access laws, there has been a legacy of not wanting to listen to people who politicians don't agree with. And that goes all the way back to the beginning of the Republic. And it's been a constant effort to advance the right of individuals to have a say in their government, to truly follow the enlightened ideals of our founding constitutional charter, but it has we have oftentimes fallen short of those ideals, and it has taken a tremendous amount of work first to get universal manhood suffrage, then to get the right for women to vote, and to ultimately defeat Jim Crow. It wasn't until a 1958 or 9 Supreme Court case that gave Asians the right to citizenship. So, we've had a long legacy of intentional disenfranchisement. And I think that from the standpoint of greater voter access and voter participation, everything Digital Democracy Project is doing, I think, is just a continuation of the original founders' vision for a government of, by, and for the people.
Mark, I'll tell you that one of the things that I truly do believe is that progress will win, and that we'll get setbacks and we'll be pushed to the floor, and we'll have people who don't believe in democracy and don't believe in freedom, really, or liberty even, in the White House and in Congress. But eventually, we will overcome that. And I guess this hopefully will be a step in the right direction. I'm certainly supportive. I do want to be clear-eyed about what the issues and the things that we need to be careful about are as we move forward. But I certainly think that unfortunately, you're probably right. On a local level, it's the hardest to do, but on the local level is where this really would be done best, because the disenfranchisement of voters on the local level, and I could speak for myself here, where I very rarely go to our town hall and vote on local issues, school board and things like that. And I probably should do more of it, but and that's why my wife got involved, because she felt that I was too invested in the national issues and not enough on our local issues that really affect us more.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Yep. And, this might correct one other thing. As you mentioned, you're going to put all those things in the federal government out there. And the idea, maybe we'll have more clean bills, because that'll mean that people, if they saw, we were talking about this in the last podcast, the president gets the budget. They have to wheel it in on a cart. Nobody knows really what's in that doggone thing, but hey, there's a lot of things this can help with. So, Ramon Perez, the organization is Digital Democracy Project. The website is digitaldemocracyproject.org. Check it out. Download the app. Register onto the site. And I think this is a great organization. I think you've got a great idea. Now, hopefully, we can get people to follow along, and hopefully we can get you back in a couple of months so we can see how you're progressing.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to. And thank you guys for having me on. I think you guys play a critical role here in the media in being able to spread new ideas. And I appreciate you guys giving me the floor for a moment.
Hey, not a problem. And if we do get some emails from some of our listeners directly about this, that they have questions, I will forward them on to you. And if you can answer that, we're more than happy. Because I know there's going to be a lot of questions, especially when I saw you're an artificial intelligence expert. And I was actually reading an email from a young lady from Seattle, Washington, who said, okay, I don't get it. Artificial intelligence takes up a whole bunch of energy. But isn't it just a program like Microsoft? So you might have to answer that. Ramon Perez, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate the time.
And that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of Nova Society Media, a division of the Phoenix Research Institute. We want to thank our production partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, our editing team, Apple Podcasts, the largest source of podcast and music online, Spotify, the most popular platform for the Nova Society, and iHeartRadio, your destination for all things music and podcasting. The Nova Society is available on all of these and other quality platforms listed in our description. And most importantly, we want to thank you, our listeners. Without your support, the Nova Society could not be possible. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing on the platform of your choice. It's easy, it's free, and helps our channel grow. For questions or comments, you can reach us at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. So on behalf of Dr. Scott Gershwer and all of our production partners here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Remember, the true power of society is knowledge. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next time.